Great. Hi, I'm Susan Glickman. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Partnerships with the Clio Institute, and we're honored to participate in Florida Climate Week, led by the Volo Foundation. And we've got a really interesting conversation we're going to have with Gavin McGuire with Reuters News. Gavin is the global energy transition columnist. So that means he keeps very busy tracking energy trends all around the world. And most recently wrote, I thought, a very insightful article about where Florida is at. And that Florida, the headline is cranking up its use of fossil gas. So there are a host of issues around that, some of which deal with climate change and our warming planet, and others are really addressed more in people's pocketbooks, in people's wallets, because we know we've all seen our power bills going up. So let's talk about that, Gavin, and I think just maybe kick it off just talking about what you found in terms of Florida's over-reliance on gas.
Thanks, Susan, for having me on, and appreciate the chance to talk about this. As you said, my role is quite wide-ranging, and I kind of dig around into various different trends and data sets that I can find globally, as well as at a more micro level. I'm based in Colorado, but the US power system is one of the most interesting and dynamic ones that I track in the world. And really, there's only 2 or 3 major power centers in the world that are generating enough fossil fuels for reductions to actually matter. So I follow the US, I follow China, I follow India. And within the US, it's quite a complicated and messy situation. Some states are doing better than others in terms of reducing emissions, and some are doing worse. And one of the ones I found to be, going in the opposite direction to what the national trend is Florida, and it's a substantial power sector. It's the biggest, third biggest in the country, very large population. It's also at the forefront of climate change issues, as you guys have seen recently. And I wanted to say, very sorry to have seen all of the damage caused there. But I was surprised when I dug into the data at the state level how substantially reliant on fossil fuels Florida remains, despite there being, within the last 5-10 years, a lot of incentives to move away, to maybe diversify the power sector, and to try to improve the efficiency of the power sector. But Florida seems to be almost alone in getting worse, more reliant, whereas everybody else, including states like Texas and Louisiana, they're getting better. And I was surprised by that. So that's why I wrote the column that I did, that you mentioned.
Well, what do you see in your findings that's driving that? I look at the Sable Trail pipeline, which was built relatively recently by NextEra, which is the parent company for Florida Power and Light, the biggest utility in the state of Florida. And then Duke Energy also has a piece of that pipeline, Sable Trail, which goes from Alabama, to Orlando. And, as that pipeline came online, I know there was pressure from FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to have customers, right? I joke when you're a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And if you're a pipeline, you were looking for customers. And I myself have seen that driving Florida energy policy, through all of those, utilities, from the Jacksonville utility down to Orlando, which has their own utility. And in 2020, in an integrated plan that they did and voted in, they locked in 20 years of gas. And Orlando Utility Commission, OUC, that is city owned, and they have, leadership in that city that has taken action on climate. So that was a very frustrating, kind of distressing action that they took during a global pandemic with no vaccine, when they voted in to lock in more gas. So we've really seen that plant. What is your observation? What do you see driving, our increasing reliance on gas?
Well, you mentioned the importance of the pipeline. That is obviously a big investment made that they want to share the cost, but they also want to boost the utility of across the entire state. And you know, if, for all of the downsides of being highly dependent on fossil fuels, gas is better than coal in terms of the power sector. So if you can kind of increase the use of gas at the expense of coal, then you are actually making progress against emissions targets, even if it's not really in the direction that everybody would like. I think the problem with Florida is it's 78% or so reliant on gas for power. There's still about 5%, of coal in the mix. So, the next step, looks like it'll be to maybe over time reduce coal entirely, and step up gas even more. But there doesn't seem to be any plan beyond just, yes, let's burn more gas. To kind of really fortify the power system with other generation sources that are cleaner and can also be deployed to try to reduce the gas use over time. So we're still in this sort of rising gas phase for Florida. That seems to be plan A. And everybody is signing up for that because the pipeline is there. It can be connected up and down the entire state. And that seems like that's really the extent of their planning so far, really, which is a bit limited when you compare it to the options on the table available to all utilities. And when you contrast it with what's going on in other states where they're deploying very large scale renewables at a quick pace that are eating into the fossil fuel share of the mix, saving customers lots of money, reducing power emissions. None of that seems to be going on at any notable scale in Florida. Really, the only thing is let's go bigger on gas and as quickly as possible.
Yeah, it's like plan A, plan B, and plan C. One thing I did want to add to this is there was a period of time where there were proposals in Florida to build 7 coal plants at the time. So, and yes, particularly at that time, gas was seen as better. If in some abstract world, burning gas may be half the emissions of coal, but in the reality of having this pipeline, I have seen, read research that gas plants overall emissions, because of the pipeline and the fracking of the gas and the transport of the gas, can be on an emissions profile as bad as a coal plant. So I just, I just want to be clear for everybody who's kind of listening in that, that is sort of what the fossil fuel folks have said is, oh, gas is great, gas is a bridge to the future, but gas is very, very worrisome and not necessarily better on the the emission side. So yeah, that's really stunning to hear you say that even states like Texas and Louisiana are moving, and they have bigger industrial bases than Florida does, and they're managing to satisfy the needs even in manufacturing and kind of industrial work, even though they're moving more to clean. So
power companies are under, they're obliged to provide as much power as the system needs and to do it in the most efficient manner possible. And but power systems are under constant pressure from constantly rising power demand and electricity demand. Businesses and households are all stepping up use of electricity to record highs every year, and that's a trend that we can safely expect to continue for the next 20, 30 years. We will use more and more power every single year. So it's these systems need to not just satisfy the expectations for the next year, but to plan for the next 5. And it takes 5, 10 years to bring some of these systems into play and to get all of the development in place. And Florida seems to be unique in terms of it's restricting the options available. It's ruled out offshore wind. There's only limited incentives for residential solar. So the power policies within Florida seem to be not helping, but they should be. They could be. It's quite a lot of households would be very happy to install power system on top with the solar panels to try to reduce their consumption off the grid. If they and if in many other states, the local utilities are helping pay for that because they want to reduce the peak consumption load and try to keep emissions overall in check. But when you have this constantly rising power need to supply, you need to have many options on the table and to be deploying them all at the same time. And again, Florida seems to be uniquely limiting in that factor, which is a bit of a surprise given where we are. And also, some big gas power plants, they are vulnerable to whenever you have major storms like Florida has seen, they can be vulnerable to options to shutdowns whenever there is big bad weather situations. So it makes sense just from a reliability standpoint to diversify your power generation sources. But again, Florida seems to be concentrating them rather than diversifying them, which is another trend that stands out.
Yeah. Well, Florida is 75% is covered by investor-owned utilities. That's Florida Power and Light, Tampa Electric, and Duke. And we have maybe 13, 15% that are munis, like the city of Tallahassee, Jacksonville, Orlando, Lakeland. And then we have some rural electric cooperatives and so forth. So, one thing that we see a lot of is the enormous influence of these investor-owned utilities on our politics. And from campaign contributions, there, in fact, one of the former state senator who was bragging on election night about putting in a ghost candidate to strip votes from Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez. So he has just been convicted. A former CEO of Jacksonville's utility has been sentenced to 4 years in prison for some of these, underhanded machinations to buy the utility. So we kind of take, this sort of really corruption, if you will, to an art form and in the state of Florida. So it's one of the reasons we have super high power bills, but the investor-owned utilities have outsized influence, and they have made it all the things that you've just said about it could be easier to put solar on your roof, and the utilities, could be cooperative with that. And they've been exactly the opposite in the state of Florida. And we've seen just a total rubber stamp on any kind of gas infrastructure, piping into new neighborhoods that are being built. And so it's been an effort to addict us further and further and further to fossil gas. Can you say just maybe a little bit more about comparing that to some of these other states? And then I know you've done some projections and written about where gas is going to be going in the next year, because I just think for people who are already suffering with a lot of unaffordability issues with our insurance being 4 times the national average, what's going to be happening to people's power bills, especially in light of this ridiculous over-reliance on gas?
That's another complicated element to this story. I mean, so the U.S. production of gas, the world is the world's biggest producer of natural gas, and output right now is up around the highest level it's ever been. So the U.S. is a very effective producer of natural gas, and that sounds from a consumer of power probably a good situation to be in. The problem is all of the utilities are on the hook for big investment upgrades, so they cannot really afford to pass on lower costs to consumers. In fact, they're passing on higher costs all across the country. But a lot of households are benefiting from reduced power consumption because of their own, let's say, their own solar panel systems. And so there are savings available to some consumers, but not everywhere. And in Florida, basically the trend is higher for longer and every year probably rising bills. And one of the problems for the gas production industry in Florida, when the gas-based power production industry, is if you look forward to the next year's prices of gas, which are already being traded and priced in, it looks like prices are going to rise by another 30 to 40% at least.
Wow.
And that's not something that a power consuming power producer is going to eat themselves. They're going to have to pass that on to somebody. Consumers will just have to take it on the chin. Now, there may be some power industries have hedged already next year's cost of gas, which is, which can happen, and maybe that reduces the upside impact. But the trend is definitely higher. And US power producers are competing for gas against liquefied natural gas exporters. So the LNG industry is of growing importance. You mentioned the local clout that policy utilities have within Florida. Well, LNG businesses have huge clout as well, and they are sucking up surplus gas and they're shipping it overseas in the form of LNG. And those guys in particular are on the hook to deliver cheap gas to the rest of the world. So they are very aggressive at pricing in next year's gas. They've locked in low cost gas for themselves. Whereas power firms typically are a bit more lax on that side of things because they've been stung before locking into gas prices, and then suddenly the actual price will fall, and they're committed to paying a higher price than they would like, and they feel embarrassed by that. So utilities and power producers are typically all about only the next quarter or so. They don't really lock in for a full year. And then if you have an investor-based business, which is also has to ensure profits for its stakeholders on top of delivering a service, then usually the consumer is the last one to get the benefit. Usually they'll fulfill their obligations, they'll pay off their dividends or whatever it is, how they reward their investors. And then ultimately, if there's a gap in the budget, they'll just have to raise the price on the consumer who's got no other option anyway.
So that was a bit of bad news, right? So Floridians are probably looking at another 30% or more of an
possibly in the price of gas for sure. And how that translates into your energy bills depends quite a bit, but it's not going to it's not going to reduce your energy bill anytime soon when the gas price goes higher.
Right. And we have not been good at doing energy efficiency. In the last ranking from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, Florida Power and Light, the biggest utility, was 52 out of 53 in offering energy efficiency programs. Tampa Electric 40 and Duke 47. So we could be doing more to, and I explain this a lot to people, it's not just that they don't want people to use less electricity. If everyone captures all that low cost effective energy efficiency, it avoids the need to build more power plants. And when the business regulatory model is that you're rewarded by your capital expenditures, by building power plants and transmission lines, that's where the incentive is. And so that's why we see the system that we have. So any sort of other last thoughts? We'll kind of wrap up here. So we talked about forecasting for 2025, a little bit about, comparing to other states. So maybe any other sort of wrap up thoughts that you have?
Just, there's a cost to not making efficiency improvements beyond just the power bill side. And one of the things I was looking at to prepare for this chat was just there's a way to measure the power efficiency, the emissions intensity, really, of power systems, and you can compare them across the states. And Florida has actually improved its efficiency, its energy intensity, over the last couple of years, but it's done so at half the pace of Texas and half the pace of the national level. And I think that's, that's a rebuke for the whole state. It's not new or surprising that power costs are high or that energy demand is rising. And this has been known for quite some time. All the other power systems in the United States seem to have been on the ball and driving their efficiencies lower, driving their costs lower, reducing emissions. Florida stands out right now. It hasn't, needs to catch up. Otherwise, it's going to be one of those kind of laughing stock situations, and the Floridians are going to be the ones paying the price for the next several years if that's the case. So I think the spotlight is on Florida to see what kind of progress it can make in the next few years. It has smart people and an engaged industry there that's capable of doing it. I'll be looking closely to see how it happens.
Would you talk just for a minute about the liquefied natural gas? Because my understanding was probably 15 years ago, we really didn't have in the US an industry for that. And now everybody's going great guns. And in the last Florida legislative session, they've actually made it increasingly easier to site these storage facilities, and pipelines don't have to go through sort of the rigorous approvals if they're under 100 miles. So they really seem to be setting the stage. So love to hear just a little
Yeah,
bit
there's even
at,
pressure to develop an export hub in Jacksonville. Yes, so the LNG industry has been around for 30, 40 years at least, globally, but the US has been a fairly recent kind of participant in it. And only within the last 10 years or so have we seen the build out of any kind of substantial liquefied extraction capacity. So what they do is they just basically suck up the regular natural gas, they liquefy it, put it onto a tanker, and then send it to big markets overseas. Japan is the world's largest consumer, but in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that disrupted the European gas market so immensely, and because a lot of Western companies wanted to buy less Russian gas as a kind of punitive measure against Russia, but they were very gas centric in terms of their power generation system. So they needed to replace the lost pipeline gas from Russia with liquefied natural gas, which they could import from other countries. And the US exporters were in the right place at the right time. And they basically doubled the volume that they sold into Europe. And they were able to charge the highest prices ever, 5, 10 times higher than the cost of regular natural gas, to customers within Germany, the Netherlands, etc. And so that was a dramatic profit boom. They've earned tens of billions of dollars doing this, and this play continues. The price of US gas, even though it's high and rising, from an historical perspective, it is still a fraction of the cost of gas in places like middle of Europe, because they're still suffering from the after effects of the Russia situation. And so the profit potential for turning US gas into LNG is enormous. And American businesses are good at kind of exploiting these situations. And so they're building out export capacity at a record pace, and everybody wants in on it. Every state would like a bit of that action. If you can turn gas into money, they'll do it. But the problem is, again, if you're a captive market, you don't want to have to compete for the gas with another business. The power industry used to be the only consumer of natural gas. Now we have an exporting industry that sells that gas to other utilities in other countries. And that new industry is growing. It's got lobbyists in influential areas, and it's probably going to continue to grow for the next few years because there's a lot of money to be made.
can you just speak to the emission side of that? What, I've been working on climate and energy issues for 24 years, and I separate things about, one thing is to pick your pocket, right? One thing is to lock you into gas and have your bill go up. It's another thing that we are altering the climate of the planet. So the things, that I have read about LNG make it sound pretty scary for what that's going to do to emissions globally. But our contribution. Can you talk to the emissions piece?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, the gas system, begins at a well in the middle of, let's say, Oklahoma or Pennsylvania, and is then, typically put into storage tanks and pipelines, and eventually burnt at a power station. And all along those supply chains, there's leakage happening. In methane is a particularly potent natural gas, much more potent than carbon dioxide. So and because the world is getting gassier in terms of its reliance, power systems are moving from coal to gas. We want more gas, we're moving more gas, we're storing more gas all the time. And that's all seeping into the air in various little leakage points along the supply chain. And now we're also adding LNG, where they super freeze it and then move it across the planet in massive tankers, where it's then regasified, where there's more leakage, and then it enters another pipeline system that eventually leads to a power station and is burned somewhere else. So we're kind of stretching out the world's gas supply lines, and at each point across the planet, there's leakage of methane, worsening things, in terms of the emissions in the air. Also, the tankers that are moving the gas, they're making their own emissions. Sometimes they're using the gas in the hold, but most of the time they're using marine fuel, which again is just pushing more emissions into the planet. So the US is helping the world burn more gas, but it's also, as it supplies it, it's also contributing to more emissions along the way.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty scary scenario. And, obviously we've just seen this unbelievably historic massive storm with Hurricane, Helene to have affected the coast from Florida to Virginia, and, unbelievably striking, what's going on in North Carolina and Tennessee and so forth. So, well, on that depressing note, I thank you so much for being here. I think your writing and your, sort of very just the facts, sort of approach is something that really is what we in Florida and elsewhere need to look to guide these policies, because there are much less expensive ways and ways that will, not continue to alter our climate even further, to meet our energy need. And so it was a little sobering to hear this from a climate change emissions perspective, and also what Floridians are looking at. Now, I'm a native Floridian, and Florida was always sort of a relative low cost place to live, and it just isn't anymore. And your insurance bill, we're 4 times the national average. That is the state of Florida. That is state leaders, have the responsibility for that. And then the power, your electric bill, that is state leadership, deciding who is on our Florida Public Service Commission, and whether or not we have healthy conservation goals, or whether we get more addicted to these dangerous, fossil gases. So I really appreciate your clarity and just the ability to kind of get us on the page and understand, where things are at in a fact-based way. So any last thoughts as we wrap up here? I really appreciate your time, Gavin.
Just to reiterate my thanks for having me on, and to wish you guys good luck in your discussions, and as you engage the various stakeholders up and down the state there. I mean, there are options on the table to accelerate the cleaner transition. They do take money and effort to make happen, but there is money and effort already being deployed within the Florida power sector. I look forward to continue to tracking the progress being made down there, and wish you all a safe and happy discussion this week. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So we're Susan Glickman and Gavin McGuire for Florida Climate Week, talking about Florida's over-reliance on gas and what that means to our pocketbooks, and what it means to our environment as well. So thank you.